On a cold November day in 1326, the people of Hereford gathered in morbid anticipation. News had spread like wildfire across England. Hugh Despenser the Younger, the hated favourite of King Edward II, had finally been captured. For years, his greed, arrogance and cruelty had made him one of the most despised men in the realm. Now, he was to face his reckoning. The stage was set for a punishment so savage, so deliberately humiliating, that it would echo across the centuries as one of the most brutal executions in medieval history. But the story of Hugh Despenser's end cannot be told without first understanding his rise. For he was not merely a victim of vengeance, but a man whose ambition, corruption, and lust for power had brought England to the brink of civil war. His death was not just an execution, it was a performance of retribution, a ritual of justice turned spectacle, designed to destroy not only his body but his very legacy. Rise, tyranny, and betrayal, the road to Hereford. Hugh Despenser the Younger was not born into greatness but into privilege. The son of Hugh Despenser the Elder, a trusted companion of Edward I, the younger Hugh grew up within the circles of royal power. His marriage to Eleanor de Clare, granddaughter of Edward I and heiress to vast estates in Glamorgan, cemented his wealth and influence. By the time Edward II inherited the throne in 1307, Hugh was already positioned to climb higher. It was not long before he became the king's closest companion and, according to chroniclers, his intimate favourite. Edward II had always struggled with authority, his reign plagued by weak leadership and reliance on powerful men to shore up his rule. First, it had been Piers Gaveston, whose arrogance and favouritism enraged the barons until they had him executed in 1312. In the years that followed, Hugh Despenser stepped into that same role, filling the void left by Gaveston's death. Like Gaveston, Despenser wielded the king's affection as a weapon. He monopolised royal patronage, seized lands and titles, and enriched himself at the expense of nobles and commoners alike. His greed was insatiable. He confiscated estates from widows, extorted money from wealthy merchants, and expanded his own holdings ruthlessly. Chroniclers describe him as a man who swallowed up the possessions of all, but it was not only his greed that made him hated, it was his cruelty. Despenser was accused of terrorising his Welsh tenants, of imprisoning rivals without cause, of humiliating nobles who dared oppose him. He was said to have raped the wives and daughters of his enemies, his power protecting him from consequences. His arrogance grew unchecked, for he was shielded by Edward's unwavering loyalty. The barons, already resentful of Edward's weak leadership, found Despenser intolerable. In 1321, civil war erupted. Led by Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, a coalition of nobles forced the king to exile Hugh and his father. For a brief moment, it seemed Despenser's downfall was assured. But Edward, infatuated and dependent, refused to abandon him. By 1322, the king had recalled the Despensers, crushed the barons at the Battle of Boroughbridge, and executed Lancaster. With his enemies destroyed, Hugh Despenser's power grew to terrifying heights. The years that followed were some of the darkest of Edward II's reign. Despenser became, in effect, the ruler of England. He controlled access to the king, dictated policy, and enriched himself beyond measure. His tyranny spread fear throughout the land. Nobles who resisted were imprisoned, exiled, or executed. Estates were confiscated under false charges of treason, swelling Despenser's wealth. Chroniclers claimed he bound the king as though he were a prisoner. Edward's will bent entirely to his, but power bred arrogance, and arrogance bred enemies. Among them was Queen Isabella, Edward's French wife. Humiliated by Despenser's dominance over her husband, denied access to her own children, and stripped of lands, Isabella's resentment grew into hatred. When Edward's war with France in 1325 forced him to send her abroad as mediator, Isabella seized her chance. In Paris, she allied herself with Roger Mortimer, an exiled English nobleman, and together they plotted Despenser's destruction. By 1326, Isabella and Mortimer invaded England with a small force, quickly gaining support from disaffected nobles and towns. Edward and the Despensers fled west, but their power crumbled. The people, long oppressed, now turned against them. Hugh the Elder was captured and executed gruesomely in Bristol, hanged on a gallows 40 feet high, a preview of the fate awaiting his son. The younger Despenser was hunted down near Neath in South Wales, disguised and starving. He was dragged in chains before Isabella and Mortimer, his downfall complete. The man who had once wielded the king like a puppet now stood trembling, powerless, at the mercy of those who had suffered under his rule. What awaited him was not a simple death, but a reckoning, a ritual of vengeance staged for all to see. His crimes had been many, his arrogance intolerable, and his enemies would ensure that his punishment matched the hatred he had inspired. The trial was swift and merciless. At Hereford, in November 1326, Despenser was accused of every crime imaginable: theft, corruption, rape, sodomy, and treason. He was not allowed to speak in his defense, his guilt declared before the charges were even finished. The sentence was death, not by the sword or axe, but by the full ritual of hanging, drawing, and quartering, the most brutal punishment medieval England could devise. And so, Hugh Despenser the Younger was condemned to a death designed not merely to end his life, but to annihilate his dignity, to strip him of all power, and to satisfy the vengeance of a nation. The stage was set, the crowd gathered, and what followed was an execution so savage, so humiliating, that even in an age accustomed to cruelty, it shocked those who saw it. The day of execution, a ritual of terror and humiliation. On November 24, 1326, the city of Hereford braced itself for a spectacle unlike any other. Word had spread quickly through the countryside. Hugh Despenser the Younger, the king's hated favourite, would be executed. For years his cruelty and arrogance had poisoned England. Now his enemies, Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer, would make certain his punishment was as brutal as his tyranny. Crowds filled the streets, pressing against one another for a glimpse. Merchants abandoned their stalls, farmers left their fields, even children clambered onto rooftops. This was not just an execution, it was theatre, vengeance written in blood. The air trembled with anticipation. Despenser was brought forth in chains, a pale shadow of the man who had once ruled England beside Edward II. Starved from his flight, trembling from fear, he was barely recognizable. Yet humiliation came before death. Stripped of his fine clothes, he was dressed in a coarse tunic, mocked as a common criminal. Around his neck was slung a scroll listing his supposed crimes: theft, corruption, sodomy, rape, treason. The charges were read aloud to the jeering crowd, each accusation met with shouts of rage and satisfaction. Then began the degradation. Despenser was forced to ride through the city, not on a noble horse, but on a mangy pony, facing backward, a crown of nettles shoved upon his head, in mockery of the crown he had tried to control. The people spat at him, hurled dung, cursed his name. To see the king's favourite brought so low was a moment of catharsis for those who had suffered under his tyranny. At the edge of the city, a great scaffold had been erected, tall, looming, designed so none could miss a single detail of the horror to come. Despenser was dragged to its base, his face drained of colour, his body trembling. There was no trial here, no chance for defence. Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer had already decreed his fate. The sentence was to be carried out in full: hanging, drawing, and quartering, the ultimate punishment for treason. But this would be no ordinary execution. It would be prolonged, theatrical, and tailored to Despenser's crimes. His enemies sought not only his death, but his utter humiliation. The first act began with the hanging. Despenser was hoisted high, the rope tightening around his neck as the crowd roared approval. His body convulsed, his face darkened, his breath choked away. Yet he was not to be granted the mercy of death. Before his life could slip away, he was cut down, gasping, broken, still alive. The hanging was not meant to kill him, but to begin the ritual of destruction. Then came the most infamous part of his punishment. Before the watching multitude, Despenser was stripped naked and fastened to a wooden frame. The executioner worked with deliberate cruelty, castrating him before the eyes of the crowd. His severed genitals were burned in a brazier, the fire hissing as the flesh shriveled. It was a punishment meant to mock the accusations of sodomy and sexual corruption that had clung to Despenser for years. The symbolism was unmistakable. His lust, his arrogance, his abuse of power were being destroyed at their very root. Next, the executioner cut open his abdomen, pulling out his entrails while he still lived. His bowels were fed into the same fire, the smoke curling upward as the crowd watched in horrified fascination. Chroniclers wrote that Despenser shrieked in agony, his cries echoing across the scaffold, though some accounts insist he bore it with grim silence. Either way, the torment was drawn out, each act of mutilation designed to prolong his suffering, to make his body a canvas of vengeance. Only after this ordeal was his heart torn from his chest and cast into the flames. At last, when life could no longer cling to him, his head was severed with an axe, lifted high before the crowd in triumph. Yet even death was not the end. His body was hacked into 4 parts, each limb destined to be sent to the corners of the kingdom, Newcastle, York, Dover and Bristol, as a warning to all who might follow in his path. His head was set upon London Bridge, a grotesque trophy, a reminder that no man, however powerful, was safe from retribution. Aftermath: the fall of Edward II and the legacy of Despenser's death. When Hugh Despenser's mutilated body was finally reduced to fragments and scattered across the kingdom, the execution itself was over. But the echoes of that November day in 1326 resounded far beyond Hereford. For Despenser's destruction was not merely the end of one man, it was the unravelling of a regime, the shattering of Edward II's authority, and the beginning of a new chapter in England's turbulent history. Edward II, the weak and indecisive king who had clung to Despenser with almost desperate devotion, was left broken. Despenser had been more than a minister or a courtier. He had been Edward's shield, his enforcer, his confidant. Some chroniclers even suggested his lover. With Despenser gone, Edward stood alone, stripped of his protector and surrounded by enemies. The speed of Edward's fall mirrored the swiftness of Despenser's destruction. Within weeks of the execution, Edward was forced to abdicate. In January 1327, he was compelled to renounce the throne in favour of his teenage son, Edward III. The once mighty king was reduced to a prisoner, his crown taken, his dignity destroyed. Like Despenser, he too would meet a brutal and mysterious end, murdered in Berkeley Castle later that year, in a death as infamous as his favourites. The image was clear: the tyranny of the Despensers and the weakness of Edward had collapsed together, their downfall cemented by the blood spilled at Hereford. For Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer, the spectacle of Despenser's death was the climax of their rebellion. Isabella, once humiliated and sidelined by Despenser's dominance over her husband, now paraded her victory. Chroniclers describe her watching the execution with cold satisfaction, her vengeance complete. Mortimer, her ally and lover, stood at her side, the architect of the downfall. Together, they had rid themselves not only of a hated enemy, but of the shadow that had defined their political exile. Yet the memory was not one of triumph alone. Chroniclers like the Vita Edwardi Secundi and the Brut Chronicle recorded the execution in lurid detail, dwelling on the humiliation, the castration, the burning entrails. The horror of it lingered as much as the justice. To future generations, Despenser's death stood as one of the most brutal punishments ever inflicted on a man of high rank in England.